Russia has entered a full-blown red alert. Vladimir Putin, ever more frantic, is scrambling for options as panic spreads, cities burn, and the economy chokes on smoke, largely because Ukraine is hammering Russian infrastructure with relentless strikes. Backed into a corner, the Kremlin has taken one of its boldest wartime steps so far, a move that will echo for years and simultaneously exposes how bleak the situation has become. On October 22nd, Russia's military publicly declared it would summon army reservists nationwide to guard domestic infrastructure. Vice Admiral Vladimir Smolyansky, deputy chief of the main organizational and mobilization directorate of the General Staff, essentially the country's chief conscription official, delivered the announcement on television, and his words revealed far more than intended. He began by framing the decision as an effort to raise security for critical assets and facilities vital to citizens, insisting the state would enlist the most prepared and patriotic people to protect civilian sites deep inside Russia. Even that preface spoke volumes. First, it underscored extraordinary desperation. The Kremlin would not make such a declaration unless forced. For years, Putin and his circle have projected confidence, leaning on lies, propaganda, and spin to sell an image of steady progress. Russia advancing daily, sanctions shrugged off, Ukraine cornered. While the outside world sees through this, the domestic information sphere, dominated by state TV and tame newspapers, lets the Kremlin curate reality and bury the worst truths. Now, however, the leadership has had to concede that the plan is failing. It admits Ukraine's attacks on infrastructure are too dangerous and that current defenses cannot stop Kyiv's drones. The army is tied down at the front, so the state is telling reservists to lace up and shield the homeland. From that, a second conclusion follows. Ukraine's campaign is working. For months, Kyiv has prosecuted a systematic air offensive against high-value infrastructure across Russia, especially fuel and energy nodes. Oil refineries, storage tanks, and pipelines have exploded in precision strikes, sending shockwaves and smoke columns into the sky. Night after night, fires have lit the horizon as oceans of fuel went up in minutes. No single blast defines the war, but together they are battering Russia's economy and war machine. A sprawling fuel crisis is now rippling through numerous regions and major cities. Prices spiking, motorists stuck in hours-long queues, stations cutting services or imposing strict caps, some shutting altogether. Ukraine shows no intention of stopping. Russia has failed to protect itself, hence the turn to reservists to guard the refineries, pipelines and plants that remain. Smolyansky added that reservists would undergo special training before deployment. A draft law, he said, clarifies their roles and allows sending them to dedicated training camps to defend vital infrastructure, energy systems, transport hubs, refineries, strictly within their own regions. He stressed that the Defense Ministry's new draft law limits them to domestic duties far from any special military operation areas and that this was absolutely not nationwide mobilization. He drew a bright line between reservists and contract soldiers. Reservists, he claimed, are civilians with full civilian rights who previously served and who voluntarily enter reserve contracts, able to keep their primary jobs while performing reserve duties, closer to a part-time National Guard than active troops. He doubled down. This is not mobilization, no conscription to war zones, no deployments outside Russia. History urges caution. Kremlin statements are often unreliable, a pattern of denials followed by abrupt reversals. It is entirely possible that despite the Vice Admiral's assurances, this is a stepping stone toward a broader mobilization of roughly 2 million reservists under contract but not normally obligated to serve. Even as officials insist, these reservists will only defend local infrastructure and will not be sent to occupied Ukrainian regions such as Donetsk or Luhansk. The Kremlin's knack for flexible rules invites skepticism. Quiet policy shifts could, in time, funnel these so-called reservists to frontline sectors. There is evidence for such a trajectory. First, the Kremlin's record, repeated claims of restraint followed by escalatory action. Putin has allegedly intimated to US President Donald Trump a willingness to pause or negotiate, only to unleash record drone and missile salvos days later. Before the invasion, senior officials repeatedly swore there would be no war. Former EU Ambassador Vladimir Chizov in January 2022 dismissed invasion warnings as Western hysteria, yet the tanks rolled in. Even the euphemism special military operation is language warfare designed to soften and delay the public's grasp of reality. The same script may be running now. Start with voluntary reservists guarding the rear. Then, weeks later, reveal that some are headed to the front. Second, Smolyansky's insistence that this is not mobilization was conspicuous. He revisited the point again and again. Reservists are different, voluntary, contract-based, bound to Russian territory. Overemphasis can be a tell. When officials hammer a talking point, it is often because there is something to hide or because they are trying to inoculate the public against coming shifts. Third, money. Russia's economy is buckling. Early in the war, the Kremlin blunted the shock of sanctions through stockpiled reserves, tighter ties with partners like India and China, and efforts to reduce dependence on Western imports. But inflation and punishing interest rates kept biting, and as the war nears its fourth year, the strain is acute. Sanctions continue to sever Russian finance and business from global networks. The ruble's stability is fragile, inflation is high, recession looms. Ukraine's strikes on fuel infrastructure amplify the pain. The Kremlin refuses to end the war and is financially enmeshed with its military-industrial complex, but it is seeking to cut costs. Recruiting has become exorbitant. Despite catastrophic casualties, some estimates claim total losses could surpass 1.4 million, with nearly 500,000 dead. The Kremlin is still signing up tens of thousands monthly, paying ever larger bounties to sustain the flow. Analysts this year reported that Russia spent just over 2 trillion rubles, about $24.6 billion, on manpower in the first half of 2025 alone. Roughly 400 billion in signing bonuses, 860 billion in service pay, and more than 750 billion in compensation to families of the dead and wounded. At that pace, 2025's manpower bill could surpass 4 trillion rubles, nearly $50 billion, about 2% of GDP and almost 10% of the federal budget. One estimate suggested Russia is burning through around 2 billion rubles, about $24 million, daily just in signing bonuses. This is unsustainable. Cheaper manpower, reservists, looks attractive. Find a legal door to move them into Ukraine, and costs drop. The US-based Institute for the Study of War has warned that the Kremlin appears to be preparing to mobilize reservists on a rolling basis to fight in Ukraine for the first time, noting that the current incentive-driven volunteer pipeline is stalling despite higher payouts. The institute points to an insider claim that about 292,000 people signed contracts with the Defense Ministry by late September, some feeding a strategic reserve, and argues the October 13th draft amendment may provide the mechanism to activate this pool without a formal mobilization order. Such a strategy could save money and generate forces faster, but it is politically risky. If the public perceives reservists being coerced into Ukraine, anger may spike. The Kremlin will likely spend heavily on messaging to insist every reservist deployed cross the line voluntarily, knowing that compulsory service remains unpopular. In short, the regime is walking a dangerous tightrope. Even if it keeps these reservists inside Russia to guard refineries and transit hubs, Ukraine has already shown it can penetrate defenses with drones and missiles. More troops around targets may simply mean more needless casualties and losses. And if the plan is to edge these reservists into Ukraine, the blowback at home, where fatigue and resentment are growing, could be severe. All of this fits a broader pattern. Putin's insistence that Ukraine belongs to Russia blurs the legal line the Kremlin now draws. Earlier this year, he told a St. Petersburg forum that Russians and Ukrainians are one people and that all of Ukraine is ours, even invoking the old rule that any land a Russian soldier steps on is Russian land. If Ukraine is inside Russia by this logic, then deploying reservists within Russia could be stretched to include Ukrainian territory. That is how soft language becomes hard mobilization. Many analysts therefore expect that the very reservists now tasked with guarding fuel depots could soon appear in assaults on places like Pokrovsk. Meanwhile, popular discontent is fermenting across regions, and the Kremlin's paranoia has triggered purges that leave Putin more precarious than at any time in his rule. Subscribe and stay alert. The next phase may arrive under the guise of another limited measure until it is not.